Hi, my name is Katherine and I am an artist in Corning, New York. I'm also the owner of Purple Peach Studio, an online shop where I sell handmade items featuring my designs. And I am an avid gardener, enthusiastic houseplant parent, and plant caretaker at the Southeast Steuben County Library when we're not in isolation. I love to combine my interests in plants and gardening with my interests in art and other creative activities whenever I get the chance. So I'm especially excited to share this class with you today on how to take common household discards and upcycle them into a cute and functional planter for your windowsill herb garden or flower garden. I'm going to start today by showing you a handful of different types of containers that you might have sitting in your trash right now that you can go grab and clean out and prepare for your plants. I'll then go over 3 different ways to decorate your containers using materials you probably have around the house, and if you don't, they are easily available for curbside pickup or for delivery at this point in time. And we'll end the class with a short tutorial on how to prepare your own potting soil if you don't have any on hand, and where to find seeds if you don't have any packets around the house, so that you can get your plants growing happily in your awesome new containers. Before we get started with our decorating, I want to go over some of the types of containers that I prefer to use for this project and a couple of others that I avoid. The ones that I prefer are varieties that can't be recycled in the city recycling in my area and in many other areas. So the first one, and the one that's the most common probably, is the yogurt tub. These giant yogurt tubs are often not recyclable, and they make excellent planters. They're nice and deep, so they provide lots of space for roots to grow. You can leave your plants in these for longer than just the seedling stage, and they've got a pretty decent diameter on them as well. The best part, of course, is that they have a lid. So the main concern that we always have with plants in containers is drainage. And so what we're going to do is modify the container to allow for drainage. But when we do that, you end up with water all over your counter or floor. And the lid can be used as a drip tray to prevent that from happening. So yogurt containers like this one make a really great upcycled planter. The next type that I like, similar to the yogurt container, is the butter container. Spreadable butter usually comes in plastic tubs of varying sizes. This is a really big one. As you can see, it's probably a good 4 or 5 inches across in the middle. They're usually a little bit smaller than this. These giant ones you can leave your plants in for a long time until they're fairly mature. The smaller ones work better for plants in the seedling stage. Just like with the butter container, it has a lid that you can use for your drip tray. And it's also made of really sturdy plastic. So this plastic will hold up against a fair amount of dirt and water, as well as a growing plant. My absolute favorite container to use for upcycled planters is the cardboard milk carton. And this might be a surprising one for people because you often assume that since it's cardboard, it's recyclable. However, this cardboard is coated on the inside with a waxy, kind of plasticky substance that is what makes it waterproof, so that it can hold your milk or your orange juice or whatever liquid it's containing. And that is impossible to remove from the cardboard when you throw it away, and so it can't be separated for recycling purposes. So in most places, unless there are specialized facilities nearby, these cardboard containers are basically just non-recyclable plastic. So they make a perfect candidate for upcycling for your planters, and they last a pretty long time. They're about as sturdy as the plastic containers that I just showed you, and they are really easy to decorate as well, and have a cool way of building in some drainage to them, which I'll show you in a couple of minutes. A common one that you'll see upcycled, maybe in other places, are milk jugs like this, the plastic variety. They're not usually my first pick of container, mainly because they are recyclable in my area. Unless you modify them, once you start gluing stuff to them, you can't recycle it anymore. So once you're done with your planter, it ends up in the trash instead of the recycling. And so I prefer just to recycle these and use containers that otherwise would have been in the trash anyway. However, this type makes a really nice hanging planter, and I'll show you a little trick for modifying it later if you want to specifically make a hanging planter for your plants. Finally, if you happen to have these little plastic seedling pots on hand, the sturdier plastic variety, not the little black flimsy ones that seed start plugs come in, but ones that like the adolescent stage seedlings come in, you can also decorate these. People often will clean them out and reuse them year to year for starting or transplanting their seedlings when they get a little bit bigger. And if you want to bring a little bit of flair to your seed starting flats or trays, these make great candidates for decoration. There's one common plastic container that you probably have in your house that I really prefer not to use, and that is the mushroom container. I think other types of produce also come in these little plastic trays, but they are too flimsy to stand up very well to the modification that you need to do for plants, first of all. And second of all, they are recyclable in my area, so I just clean them out and put them in the recycling. If this is all you have to turn into a planter, go ahead and use it. Just know that you'll need to find something to put underneath it after you modify it for drainage purposes. It should last you maybe a season or so before it becomes too flimsy and starts to collapse in on itself from the weight of the dirt and the water there. The other kind of container that is similar to this that I avoid are deli containers. So those are the clear plastic clamshells. I don't have one on hand. Those are not recyclable, but they're also not very sturdy, and they're a little too flimsy for our purposes. A fun trick, though, if it is marked with number 6 recycling mark on it, even if you can't recycle number 6 in your area, you can use that kind of plastic to make shrink film from it. But that is a little outside the scope of this tutorial today. Once you have your containers picked out, it is time to do a few simple modifications to make them more hospitable for your plant babies once they are all settled in their new homes. The main thing that you want to think about when you're growing plants in any kind of container, whether it's upcycled or commercially purchased, is drainage. And you can ensure good drainage 2 ways. The first is with the container itself, and the second is with good potting soil. We'll go over the basics of good potting soil at the end of the class, but right now, since we are dealing with our containers, we're going to address that issue first. So, the primary way to achieve good drainage in a container is to provide somewhere for excess water to drain out. In this case, we are just going to poke some holes in the bottom of our containers. I've got my 2 sturdy plastic containers here. You will need either a pair of sharp scissors or a knife, or I prefer to use a drill. In this butter container, I've already made some holes in the bottom. You can see that they're pretty small, but I've done a lot of them. In this type of plastic container, I don't like to do more than 1/8 inch holes, and that is just because when you get any bigger than that, I worry about the plastic starting to lose some of its integrity and become too flimsy to support the dirt and the plant inside. So I prefer to do more smaller holes than fewer larger holes. These holes are actually a little too small, so I put a slightly larger drill bit on this drill to demonstrate on this container, which has a smaller surface area anyway, so I'll be doing fewer holes in there. This is a, what was it, 7/32 of an inch drill bit. I think my largest one is 3/8 of an inch. So it's a pretty big drill bit. You don't want to go that large, obviously. It's going to get a little bit loud, but if you feel more comfortable with it, you can mark your holes ahead of time, which I will go ahead and do with a marker or a pen. So I'm going to do one in the middle, and then I'm going to go out to the sides and just start eyeballing it on this size of container, which is probably 3.5 inches across the bottom. I am going to do, let's see, there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 holes. So I'll do 8 around the edge here and then 1 in the center, and I'll see how that looks. It's going to get loud here for a second, bear with me. I am holding the container with the empty portion underneath here so that I'm not drilling straight down into my table. Don't do that. You'd much rather drill into empty space. And if you are working with kids here, this is an adult-only activity, so have your kids stand aside while you drill. And it would help if my drill were not running backward. Whoop. Here's one. Make sure your hand is nowhere near the drill bit while you're doing this. It doesn't require a whole lot of pressure drilling into plastic like this, but you do want enough that your bit doesn't slide around. Okay, so I've got 5 there, and that's really not very much drainage at all. So I'm going to go back and drill another one in between each of the edge holes. All right. That is a good amount of drainage for this container. You can see I've just got that one in the middle. Ideally, I would probably put 2 or 3 more around the outside of it, but it has already started to crack right there, and I don't want to cause it to crack any further. So I'm going to call that good. I could go in with a hammer and a nail and poke a few small ones around the middle there if I were really worried about drainage. But in this case, I think that this will be sufficient. You can go ahead and pick off any of the little plastic doohickeys that you have stuck to your container, and I will set this aside for now. So it's fairly simple to modify a plastic tub for planting purposes. Really all you need to do is poke some holes in it for drainage. My favorite container to modify for planting is the cardboard milk carton. You might have some of these sitting around from milk or from juice or other various non-dairy milk products. I don't know what other kinds of beverages come in these containers, but they're pretty ubiquitous and they are not recyclable, at least not in my area and not in most areas. So a great way to keep them out of the trash is to turn them into planters. And the cool thing about this is you can modify it without a drill, without without poking any holes in it because it has this great drainage spout already built in. You might be saying, but the drainage spout is at the top. And obviously you're not going to plant your plants on top of the milk carton like this. So the cool thing that we do is take our milk carton, lay it down on its side. We measure about 1/3 of the way down the container from the spout. And then we take a sharp knife or pair of scissors. I find scissors to be a lot safer. And we make a little clip right there in the corner. And that's our cutting mark. If you want to be really exacting, you can take a straight edge. And for that purpose, I'm just going to use a piece of paper because you don't actually need to measure it at all. So here's my paper. I'm going to lay it right along that cut mark so it is parallel to the top edge of the carton. And I'm just going to draw a line with a pen or a marker. It doesn't have to be a very bold mark here. It's just a guideline. You don't have to be able to see it later. And I'm going to do that all the way around the carton. You're also very welcome to eyeball it. If I were not on camera, I would just be eyeballing it. But the last time I did that, it did turn out a little wonky. And so I thought for these purposes, I will be a little bit more exacting. One more mark here. Set my straight edge aside. And then go back with my scissors and cut all the way around the carton along that line. So hopefully you've cleaned your carton out really well and any container out really well before you start doing this, because once you start working with it, you will quickly become aware of how clean or dirty it actually is. Ooh, these milk cartons especially tend to trap, or these cartons especially tend to trap liquid inside even after you've cleaned them. So you might notice a little puddle after you cut it open. So, oh yeah, there's a little bit of a puddle. It's just water though. So now we've got two pieces here, the top and the bottom. You can notice that the top is a little bit smaller, so it's not quite as deep as our yogurt or butter containers, but it's still a pretty decent size. You'll be able to get some small herbs in here. This works nicely for things like thyme or well, really any herb that you want to plant inside can be grown in here. You're going to take the top part of your container and you're going to settle it right down in the bottom part of your container. And for some reason, the top parts tend to be a little bit bigger than the bottom parts. That's okay. You just have to kind of encourage it, wiggle it a little bit. And you might notice it squeezing. That's okay. So now you've got this nice little planter with a built-in drainage hole and something to catch the water that drains out of the planter portion without letting it overflow and spill all over your countertop or floor. It is theoretically possible to overflow this bottom portion, but this top portion only holds maybe 2.5 to 3 cups of dirt. So if you are putting in more than a cup of water in that, that's way too much water for the plant anyway, and that wouldn't even be enough to overflow the bottom part. You would have to really flood the top part to get it to overflow. The other nice thing about these is that it helps to maintain an even humidity level in the plant on top. The bottom part creates a little bit of a reservoir, a lot like you would find in the water table out in nature. And so as the soil on top dries out, the water on the bottom starts to evaporate and maintains an even level of moisture and humidity in the soil, which plants really like and is hard to achieve in many cases in potted plants. So happy plants and happy people. So the last container I'm going to show you how to modify is this plastic milk jug. As I mentioned before, this isn't really my favorite container to use because number one, it's normally recyclable. If you modify it, it's a lot more difficult to recycle. I prefer to use containers that I am otherwise removing from the waste stream rather than ones that could be recycled somewhere else down the line. I also find it just less attractive once it's modified, and I don't like it sitting on a countertop, to be quite honest. But I have found that it makes a really nice hanging planter because of its shape. So much like the cardboard milk carton, we are going to make a cut all the way around the edge of the milk jug. Unlike the cardboard carton, we want to hang on to the lid. So if you don't have the lid anymore, just go ahead and recycle this. You want one that still has the lid on it. And we are actually going to discard part of the container and just you can recycle the part that we cut off. So rather than cutting close to the spout, we're going to cut close to the bottom here. And I'm not even going to make a mark on here because you can see there's this nice little ridge that is going to serve as my cutting line. You can use a sharp knife if you like. I'm going to use my kitchen shears again. And I'm going to start right in the edge, at the edge there. I made my first little mark with the tip of my scissors, and now I'm going to follow that ridge all the way around, effectively cutting off the bottom of the jug. There we go. So now we've got our upside down milk jug here with no bottom, and then the bottom part. The bottom part I'm just going to throw in the recycling because it's recyclable plastic. This top part, you can see, does not work very well. It's not very stable just sitting on your countertop or floor. But because it's tapered at the bottom, it has a nice balance and can work really well as a hanging planter. This plastic is a bit more flimsy than the butter tub or yogurt tub, and I don't want to use my drill on it. The drill will be overkill and is likely to slip off and possibly injure me. So instead, I am going to use my scissors, and I'm going to cut holes just right in the corners. I want them in the center of the corners of my jug. And it's not super important if they're exactly level because you can always make up for any differences in height with your string that you add later on to make it hanging. You could use a hole punch if you wanted neater holes. I just don't have a large enough hole punch on hand, so I'm going to use my scissors again. In this case, I'm going to cut a snip in one direction, and then I will very carefully wedge the point of my scissors in there and make a snip in the other direction as well. So then I end up with like a little star shape. There we go. And that, I can take a pen and just kind of wiggle it in there. I want the sharp part of the plastic pointing inward just so I don't injure my hand on the outside. So there we go. There's one hole. I'm going to eyeball it to try to keep it even. Again, not super important if it's completely even because you can make up any differences in evenness with the string later. That one's a little bit larger. It's okay. Pen, wiggle it in there. Nice round hole. Roundish. Two more. This corner feels a little bit weaker than the other ones. Interesting. Okay. my star, poke a pen in, there's a hole. And the last one, I'm kind of folding these corners a bit too, so it's easier to get a snip. There, there's one. That wasn't big enough. Needs to be big enough to be able to get your scissor tip in the other way. Cut the other way and going down. It's a little tricky because it's wet, slippery. There we go. So we've got a hole in each corner. Now the tricky thing about this is when you decorate it, you will either need to go around the holes so that they don't get covered up, or you can just plan to go back in and reinforce the holes afterward, which is what I would do. As we're adding things to the exterior to make it look pretty, you can just go right over the holes, and I would even recommend going up over the edge and then going back in with your pen or a sharp tool and re-poking the holes before you hang it. The cool thing about this one is you can have it hanging indoors and your water won't drain out all over the place. When it comes time to water your plants, you just take it off of the hook that it's hanging on, take it to a sink or maybe your bathtub. You can undo the cap on the bottom, water your plant, let it all drain out, and then recap it and rehang it wherever it was in your home before. If you're going to hang this outside, you can just leave the cap off all the time so that the water can drain freely as you water your plant. Now that we have our containers all prepped, it's time to move on to the fun part, which of course is decorating them. I'm going to show you 3 different techniques for decorating your container and making it look less like trash and more like something you would want sitting on your countertop. I'm going to start with the most basic method that requires supplies you likely have sitting around your house, and move on to methods that require a little bit more effort and a few extra tools. But all of these are techniques that can be mixed and matched and made more or less complicated as you desire. If you don't have any of the materials on hand, they are all easily available online for delivery or at most big box stores or supermarkets. So, the very first method I'm going to show you is actually not really a method, and I'm not even going to include it in my list of 3 techniques that we're going to go over. And that is simply to paint your container. If you have a good craft stash, might have a couple of different types of paint on hand. That's awesome. I wanted to show you what different kinds of paint look like on this cardboard container. So, I would recommend using the most opaque paint that you have. So do not use watercolor. You will not be happy with the results. Of course, if you only have watercolor on hand and you really, really want to do a beautiful watercolor container, go for it. Paint on your watercolor paper and then affix the watercolor paper to the container afterward. That would be a really great solution. Don't paint watercolor directly on your container. This side, bright pink, was painted with tempera paint. So if you've got kids at home, that is washable kids paint. It often comes in bright colors in little jars, little plastic jars. This is 3 or 4 coats of paint. So when you first paint it on, it looks more like this and is fairly translucent. But if you let it dry in between each coat and then add another one on top of it, you can get a pretty opaque effect. This would be even more opaque, or the design underneath of the container would be even less visible once I start to add things on top of this solid color, like stripes or dots or gluing other things on top of it. So tempera works really well on these milk cartons as long as you have a little bit of patience. This side was painted with acrylic, and this is just 1 coat of acrylic, so you can see it's got nice coverage. Of course, different brands of acrylic are going to vary in how opaque they are. This was just a basic student grade brand, and it had really good coverage. Craft acrylic would probably be just fine. You may have to do 2 coats instead of 1. Those come in like the little, not tubes, little tiny bottles that are like about that high, in a couple of different brands and a whole range of colors for fairly inexpensive. So that's a really nice option if you feel like painting your containers. If you don't have paint on hand, the other simplest way of decorating it would be to cover it in paper and to decorate that paper. So you might have construction paper at home. That's great. Pick out a color that you like. If you don't have construction paper, copy paper or office paper works just as well. In addition to paper, you are going to want a straight edge. It doesn't have to be a ruler. It can be anything with a nice straight edge. A book, another piece of paper, something to just serve as a guideline. You want a pen or a marker or a crayon or a pencil. I guess a pencil would work. Any other sort of writing implement. It can be as basic or as fancy as you want. Ballpoint pens are super great for this. You'll want a trusty pair of scissors. They don't have to be kitchen shears this time because we're just cutting paper. And then I recommend having either clear packing tape or contact paper. If you don't have either of those, Scotch tape, like the narrow, it doesn't have to be Scotch brand, the narrow type of clear tape would also work, but it will be more time consuming to use that. So I would recommend packing tape if you have it. What we're gonna do is create a template with our paper that will cover our container. I'm working with a smaller butter tub in this case. With butter tubs, it's especially important that you clean it off really well because it can have that kind of greasy residue. But since we're covering it in paper, the outside, it's okay if it's not super clean. We're going to use our paper to create a template to cover the outside of the container. And then before we attach the paper to the container, we are going to decorate it. And you do not have to be super artistic to decorate your paper. I'm going to show you a very simple technique that you can use to get a big visual impact. So let's take our paper and our container. Very, very simple here. We're just going to hold the paper up to the container the way we would want it attached. So this one has a little bit of a rim on it. I'm gonna just make sure the edge is pushed up against the rim of the container. And then I'm gonna take my pen and I'm just gonna make a mark where I can see the bottom of the container. If you've got thick paper and can't see through it, that's fine too. You can just kind of bend it a little at the end there and you'll get a nice little crease. I'm just gonna put a dot so that I can see where the end is. I'm going to remove the container, set it aside for now, and now I'm going to take my straight edge and I'm going to line it up. If you do have little hash marks, little lines on your straight edge, it's really helpful because you can make sure that it's square with the paper, but you can also just use the corner of your straight edge to achieve that. I'm going to draw a line all the way down my paper. And that line is going to become part of the design, so I don't really care if I can see it or not. If you don't want the line to become part of your design, you can draw on the other side where you can't see it. And then I'm going to take my scissors and cut along the line. If you've got a paper cutter, that makes this work a lot faster and more exact. So this is the first part of my template. You can see it's the right height for my container, but it does not quite cover the entire container. And since it's curved too, that doesn't bother me that it is sticking off the bottom a little bit. If it bothers you, you can cut little slits, just maybe 1/8 of an inch long in the bottom there so that it conforms more closely to the edge of to the bottom edge of that container. There's a slight taper in this container and that's why it's sticking off a little bit. But that doesn't bother me. I would rather that the sleeve goes, kind of sits on the top and is just straight up and down. So since it doesn't cover the whole part of the container, I'm going to cut out another piece of paper exactly like that template. I'll just line it up on my paper. I'm going to set the straight edge aside for now. Line up those edges, make one more mark. Here's my mark. Take my straight edge, line it up against that mark, and then I'm using another hash mark over here. You can use the corner just to make sure it's square. Draw a line straight down. There we go, line number 2, and I'll do the same thing, cut it out. So if you are using this as a homeschool activity with little kids, or with, I guess, elementary school kids, this is a great opportunity to practice measuring. If you've got a ruler, you can measure the container and then measure the piece of paper and teach kids how to map that 3D space onto the 2D space of the paper, and then how to create the 2D space into a 3D object around the container. You can really turn it into a STEM activity in that way. If you're working with little kids, like mine, you can just let them loose at this point. You've got paper, hand them some crayons, hand them some markers. If you've got paint and don't mind the mess, hand them some paint. I recommend washable paint in this case, and just let them decorate the paper. Once it's dry, you can attach the paper to the container and you've got a really lovely little planter. If you're working on your own, you can turn this into more of a meditative art doodling activity, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. You don't have to be super creative to do this or to enjoy this. I love doodling, but I'm not the sort of person that just sits down and doodles without any direction. I find that it's a lot more meditative and fun for me to doodle if I give myself some structure first, and that's what I'm going to do right now. I've got my 2 pieces of paper. I'm just going to work with one right now, but you would repeat this on both pieces of paper. I'm going to divide my piece of paper, my strip of template paper here, into sections. So I'm taking my straight edge again, and this happens to be a 2-inch wide ruler, so I'm going to divide it into 2-inch wide sections. If you wanted to, you could take any type of straight edge. You could cut, a 1-inch strip of paper and use that as your template. You could use your other piece of template paper and use that as the tracing element, whatever you have on hand. The idea is just to divide your template paper into even sections. That's all we really care about. And they don't even have to be even. I'm doing even sections because I want this to be a little bit more precise. And you can see on this paper that I've got like a little piece left over at the end here, and that's okay. That's where the other template will overlap. I'll tape it together right there. Now that I have got my paper divided into even sections, I am going to fill each section with a different geometric pattern. You can use any patterns you like. Personally, I like to alternate with lines. You could do different sizes of circles, you could do dots, you could do check marks, you could do literally anything that you can think of. I find that the simpler the pattern, the better. The more you repeat a very simple pattern with small variations, the bigger the visual impact is going to be in this kind of design. So I'm going to stick with my straight edge here because I want them to be very, very even. You can also eyeball it if you want to. Again, normally I would eyeball it, but I'm going for maximum impact. So that's about, let's see how many, I'm going to go for super exact right now. That's the sort of mood I'm in. That's about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to do 1/4 inch spacing in this first section. Just lines 1/4 inch apart, straight up and down. Ah, I did it evenly. So that first section is 1/4 inch lines. The next section I'm going to do 1/8 inch lines, so twice as many lines. Again, this makes a great STEM activity. You can teach measurements here. This is proportions, fractions. Now I'm just naming math terms. You can see how it becomes kind of meditative too when you do this very simple thing over and over again. So when one of my other jobs is a yoga and meditation teacher, and one of the things you do for one of the meditation techniques you can do is to chant a mantra, and it's the same sort of thing. This is like a visual, physical mantra, doing the same very basic thing over and over again. So you can see how it's progressing here. I'll go back to 1/4 inch spacing. So I'm going to keep doing that 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch. Is that a 1/4 inch? Yes, it is. Okay. Thought I messed up there for a second. So play around with this. The probably best thing about this technique for decorating is that if you mess up, you can start over, because paper is pretty easy to come by for the most part. Maybe you run short on paper like we do. We've got a very prolific junior artist here who goes through reams of paper pretty quickly. But you can always shred your old paper and make new paper if you run out, right? Back to my 1/8 inch lines. So you can achieve a similar visual impact by, rather than altering the spacing, you can alter the direction of the lines to get kind of a basket weave pattern. That's cool. So horizontal lines and vertical lines. You can do diagonal lines. You can do zigzag lines. You can do perpendicular lines and then color in alternating boxes to get a checkerboard. And there I go again, using math terms. So again, lots of ways to incorporate STEM into this particular method. Back to my 1/4 inch lines. This is the last section, and then I'll hold it up again so you can see. And if you wanted to go back and color in alternating spaces in the lines to give it more of an emphasized stripe, to emphasize the stripe pattern on it, you can certainly do that. Again, as basic or as complicated as you want it to be. But I did want to show how even just drawing a line over and over and over again can have a pretty cool visual impact on your container. So here is the finished template. And then when you wrap it around your container, you get this sort of wave effect. Turn it around. So there's one half of my template. I will go back and do the same thing on this template later, but I do want to show how to attach it to the container. So you can go ahead and just tape it with Scotch tape if you really want to, or masking tape against the back. So you would like roll up the tape and then put it on the back and then stick it to the container. That's fine. And if you've used waterproof marker or pen on your paper, that is sufficient. It's not going to last as long as if you laminate it, which I'm going to show you how to do next, but it'll last you a season. I recommend coating your paper in either contact paper or tape to give it a laminated effect. And that's just to protect it from the elements. Even though it's sitting on your counter, you're still going to be watering this plant, and water tends to drip from the containers. And if you're using this sort of container with drainage holes in the bottom and it's sitting in a tray, it has a tendency to absorb some of the water that is sitting in the tray also, which can discolor your design. And if you've used washable markers especially, it tends to give it a tie-dye effect and ruin your pattern on it. So I like to cover it with a little bit of contact paper or packing tape first. I've got packing tape handy. So I'm going to pull, let's see, my template is just too large for the width of this tape, so I'm going to use 2 pieces of tape on here and I'll overlap them in the middle. I'm just going to eyeball it. I want it to overhang. Oh, be very careful, it's sticky. Gonna pull it gently off. Oh no! Okay, no, I'm gonna leave it. Don't be like me. This one is all crooked now. Sad. Okay, well, so you can see packing tape is kind of hard to work with. I'm gonna set this aside and I'll just demonstrate on my blank template. I want the tape to overhang the template by about 1 inch, and that's so I can tape it directly onto the container, as well as to the next piece of the template. So it's good if you haven't attached your template to the other piece yet. Okay. Holding the tape well away from your paper. You're going to take it at one end, starting at one end. You'll hold it kind of above the paper to line it up. You want maybe 1/4 inch overhanging the top, and then 1/4 inch hanging off the back, and then another maybe inch. I've got a good 2 inches hanging off of the other end. And I'll start with the short end, the side that doesn't have as much hanging off the short end. And I'm just going to smooth it down a little at a time onto my paper. Starting at one end, you avoid catastrophes like I had with my decorated piece, and you also avoid air bubbles. And I'm just smoothing it all the way down, and I'm going to hold my tail end of the paper, or of the tape here, and use that to peel it up off of the table. And now you can see I've got my paper attached to the tape. I'm going to go ahead and kind of prop that tail end up on something like my container or the straight edge or even a pen. A pen might work better. And that's just to keep it from permanently attaching to the table. That tape is really hard to peel off if you don't have a loose end, which makes it good packing tape, I guess. Again, holding it well away from my paper. And I'm going to line up the ends, doesn't have to be perfect. Ooh. And I'll tape that short end all the way down to my table, and then I'm going to smooth it down, avoiding air bubbles as I go. And I didn't get it lined up perfectly, but that's pretty good. So now I'll pick up my pen that has the long end on it, ooh, my other long end, and I'll peel it up off of my table. Good way to test if the paint on your table is still sturdy. So now I've got my container, and I'm going to work kind of in reverse there. So I've got my short end. I'm going to hold that up against my container here. And you can see here on the lip, I'm just pushing that tape up under the lip to create a little bit of a seal. And I've got my edge of the paper pushed up against the top of the container here under the lip. So again, this container was tapered a bit at the bottom, so it's not perfectly straight up and down. And so I know that that paper is going to stick off a little bit. It's going to be more like a sleeve than a cuff. Is that right? Anyway, I'm going to continue. I'm focusing on the top edge because that's my wider edge. And I know that it'll wrap around nicely up there. So now I've got to the long end of my tape, and I'm just going to continue wrapping that around. And I would do exactly the same thing with my remaining piece of template to cover up that blank spot. So now I know that this bottom part is going to stick off a little bit from the container. There's going to be a little bit of a gap there. That's okay. It doesn't bother me. If you want to really get it tight against the edge of the container, you can cut like a little dart in there. So you don't even have to cut a triangle. Just cut a slit, and then you can use that to fold your paper over. You'll overlap the edges a little bit. I am going to set my container down on the table, and I'm going to take this plastic on the tape and fold it over the edge of the paper, creating like a little plastic foot on the bottom of my container. This is going to protect the paper. It's going to seal out any water from the bottom when it's sitting in the tray. And around this gap, I'm just going to push this tape down into the gap, creating a little seal there and making a little lip on the edge of the paper. And since it's curved, it gets a little bit messy over here. I'm just gonna kind of pinch it on itself. And then you can either, if it doesn't want to stick down, you can take your scissors and just trim off that little bit of excess. And it'll still be sealed. It's not going to hurt anything. So if I hadn't ruined my patterned piece of template, you would be able to see how that cool pattern looks wrapped around. Let's see if I can salvage this. Oh yeah, just fold the tape over, extra lamination. There, we'll pretend wrapped around the container there. Okay, the second method we have for decorating our containers is decoupage. You probably have heard of decoupage before. It's a very long-standing method of surface design and decoration. You probably have done decoupage in the past, even if you didn't realize it, because it's a very common craft technique in elementary schools, which also makes it a really fun activity for kids to do if you've got kids at home with you. Decoupage is essentially just covering the surface with little tiny pieces of material that you glue down, and then you add another layer of glue on top of it to give it a varnished finish. I've got a couple of examples here of what I mean by decoupage, or of decoupage with different materials. This first one here is craft paper or construction paper, torn into little pieces and decoupaged onto a yogurt container. And then my daughter took some of her sparkly foam stickers that she has and added them to the top for a little bit of extra pizzazz. It's got some catnip growing in it right now. This is a container that I did with fabric scraps that I cut into mostly triangle pieces for a sort of mosaic effect. This one's got some mint growing in it. This was also done on a plastic container. And then this one is a cardboard milk carton that I decoupaged first with white office paper, and then once that was dry, I went back and added some tissue paper, just normal gift wrapping type tissue paper in some abstract designs. And since the tissue paper is translucent, you can see the layer underneath also, so you get a little bit of a color mixing effect there. So you've got lots of possibilities for things that you can glue to the surface of your container. We are working primarily with non-porous containers here. So a lot of plastic or coated cardboard, which is basically a plasticized cardboard. And when you're working with a non-porous surface, you want to be sure that you're using, number one, a porous material to start. So fabric, paper, tissue paper, wrapping paper, magazine scraps, things like that that will absorb some of the glue are your best bet for your first layer at least. After you get that porous layer applied to your container, you can go crazy with buttons and sequins and little plastic gemstones or natural materials like acorn caps or stones or whatever you happen to find. Bottle caps would be a really cool thing, not a natural material, but would make a neat mosaic layer on top. And that's just because the glue needs something to adhere really strongly to, and that porous material that you add creates a nice sticky layer, a nice grippy layer on your container. The other thing to remember working with a non-porous surface is that you want this porous material that you're applying to go all the way around with no gaps. So that means when you are putting your little pieces of paper on, you want all of the edges to overlap as you're applying them. And I'll demonstrate what I think is an effective technique for making sure that happens. But you can see on this container too, I've wrapped the whole thing I've covered the whole thing in this white office paper with very few gaps in between. If there were gaps in between my pieces of office paper, that layer would start to peel off. And so that's especially important to remember when you're going around these corners. The temptation is often to stop at the corner and then start again on the next side, but you want to take your pieces and wrap them around the corners. It's a little easier to accomplish on a round container like one of these yogurt containers because it's a continuous surface anyway. But with these corners, sometimes it's easy to create gaps without meaning to. Same goes for up at this edge here where we've inserted the top part into the bottom part. So I'll set these aside for now, but you can get some ideas from the different materials that I've used for things that might be effective for your decorations if you don't have one or more of these materials at home. So when I've got some materials prepared here. When you are preparing your materials, the thicker the material you're attaching, the smaller you want to cut it. So for example, this craft construction paper, it's actually fairly thin as far as construction paper goes. But if you're using something that's more of a cardstock weight, you would want it to be a 1/4 inch or smaller, I would say. And that helps it to stick to the surface a little bit better and contour to the surface. So we're working again with a 3-dimensional surface, whether it's curved or around those corners. And so the smaller it is, the better it will adhere to or conform to the shape of the surface. This fabric here is really thin and pliable. You can use really big pieces if you want. This is probably about 1 inch long. Office paper is pretty thin also. I've divided it into pretty big pieces here. They're probably about 1 inch square. If you want more of a textured effect, you could use smaller pieces, maybe a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch, but they can be as big as you want them to be. And then tissue paper is the thinnest. It's very translucent, and you can use big pieces. The challenge with the tissue paper when you start using large pieces is it tends to get wrinkly. So keep that in mind. I like to keep mine to about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. Other materials you'll need: some sort of adhesive. I really like Mod Podge. It lasts a really long time. This bottle is 7 years old already. If you don't have Mod Podge, you can use white craft glue, like Elmer's, or a lot of big box stores have their own brand of in-house craft glue. It needs to be the white kind that dries clear or translucent. If you're using craft glue, especially if you're using one of the thicker kinds like tacky glue or something like that, that, you'll want to thin it down with a little bit of water. For Elmer's glue, I usually add maybe half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of water per tablespoon of glue. So it's not a whole lot of water. You just want to get it to a nice spreadable consistency. If it's too thin though, then you start to lose adhesive properties and it won't work as well for sticking things onto your container. You'll also want something to apply the adhesive with. I like to use a flat paintbrush like this, just because it has a nice surface coverage. You can also use a foam paintbrush like this one. These are great when you're working with kids especially, or if you're especially concerned about getting a nice smooth finish to the top of your container, if you want that very varnished look. This will help you avoid getting any brush stroke marks in your adhesive, which we'll talk about too as I go over the technique. This foam brush in particular is a little bit large, which is why I'm not using it. It'll work, but I personally would prefer one that's about half that size for this size of container. And then if all else fails, if you don't have any sort of paintbrush or any sort of foam brush, you can use a paper towel that you've gotten wet and then wrung out really well. And you can use that just to dab the glue on to your container and then over the pieces that you're applying. You just want it to be a little bit wet so that it is more pliable and it won't absorb all of your glue and dry really quickly. One thing to keep in mind, since we're working with upcycled materials here, they have a pattern on them already. And if you're using a very transparent or thin material, like tissue paper, for example, you'll be able to see the pattern underneath. If the material is transparent when it's dry, before you glue it, that is, it will be transparent after the glue dries also. So you can see right through that yellow piece. Office paper, on the other hand, is not quite as transparent. When I apply the glue to it, it'll get damp and you'll be able to see through it, but once it's dry again, once that glue dries, you won't be able to see the material underneath. My fabric was a little bit transparent. I don't know if the light is right for you to be able to see what kind of container that is underneath, but it wasn't enough to bother me. If seeing the design of your container underneath is going to bother you, add an opaque layer before you add your more transparent layer, which is what I've started to do here. You can see I've covered the first 3 sides in torn out pieces of office paper, and it's given it a fairly opaque white finish. I really like this textured appearance, and so I wanted to tear my pieces into smaller pieces, which is a little bit more time consuming because then you have more to glue, but it gives kind of a cool textured appearance once it's dry. You can also see that I have done my best to alter the direction of each of my pieces as I'm applying them. That also contributes to that textured effect. You, of course, if you prefer it to be in nice, neat rows, you can do that instead. It'll just have a different appearance at the end. So I'll show you how I applied that office paper first, and then I'll show you a fun collage technique that you can use to decorate the second layer. I also keep a little jar of water on hand just to keep my brush from drying out if I have to set it down in between applications. The glue is water soluble, so it'll come off of your brush once it's dry. It's not going to destroy your brush the way like masking fluid or some sort of dry acrylic would. But it's just kind of a pain to clean, and I don't want to have to clean it if I don't have to. So I keep it in the brush just to keep, or I keep it in the water just to keep it damp. I also prefer to put my adhesive, my glue, I'm just going to be calling this glue from now on, into a smaller container while I'm working so I don't have to stick my whole brush down into the container. It's just hard to gauge how far down I need to stick it, and I don't want to cover the entire bristles in glue because that would be a waste of glue. So I just pour a little bit into my lid. And about a quarter size amount is going to be enough to cover this first surface here. Set my water aside, got my glue. I'm just going to dip the very tip of my brush into the glue, and I'm going to work with a small area at a time. And that's because this stuff dries really fast. If I were to apply it to the entire container, it would dry before I could put all of my pieces down. And since this seam right here between the top and the bottom part is kind of a problem area that I want to be sure gets covered well, that's where I'm going to start. So I apply a thin, translucent layer of glue, and then I'm just going to take my paper and put it down on top of the glue. Before I apply any other paper, I'm going to coat that first one with another layer of glue. And with these pieces, I am starting at the center of the piece and working my way out to the edges. And that is just to ensure that all of the air bubbles are out, it doesn't wrinkle, and all of the edges get covered. If I were to start at the edges, especially with a bigger piece like this, and pull in, this paper is thick enough that it might not wrinkle, but thinner materials especially would start to wrinkle. And we want a nice smooth application. So that top is wet now. I'm going to move on next to it and apply a little bit more glue in a translucent layer so you can see right through that. Add a little bit more. This is a long piece, and I'll put this at a different angle. And then apply another layer on top. So another thing to consider, if you do end up with glue in a larger area, you still want to put one piece of paper down at a time and coat the paper with glue before moving on to a new area. And that's because you want to be very careful that you are overlapping the edges of this first layer. And that's to make sure that all of these pieces adhere nicely to the container. If I were to just start putting paper down without adding a layer in between sheets, then they wouldn't stick to each other, and then they would start to peel off. I'm going to put a little bit of glue underneath the seam also, just for good measure. They make all different kinds of Mod Podge now. The stuff that I'm using is a matte finish, and to the best of my knowledge, it's all water-based, so it cleans out of your brush really easily. It's not going to destroy your furniture. But you can get a gloss finish. You can get dishwasher safe if you want to, for example, decoupage on the outside of a mug. You can get outdoor safe. So if I were planning to put these containers outside, then I would probably have gone with that for a little bit more waterproofing. This finish is going to be water resistant enough for an indoor container, but it's not something that I would want to have sitting out in the rain or getting soaked repeatedly. This piece of paper has a nice straight edge because it was the edge of the sheet that I tore up. So I'm going to put it right along the top of my container, but you could also put it so that it overhangs and then wrap it around the edge, and that might give the edge a little bit more of a finished appearance. And for each of these sides of the container, I've started at the corners and worked my way in, because the corners are the part of the container where things will start to peel off if you're not careful. So you want to make sure that all of the pieces at the corners are wrapping around the edges. So you can see right here, I've got from the previous side, all of these pieces wrapping around. And then as I work my way through this side, I will also wrap around. But those corners were the ones that I covered first. If you start to get too much glue on your container, your pieces will start to slide around a little bit. If that happens, you can either spread the glue out more with your brush, or you can wait for it to dry a little bit, and that usually does the trick. Or just go really gently as you're applying the second layer of glue. Once this is all dry, it'll have a nice, fairly hard varnished effect to it, and other materials will stick really nicely on top. So traditional decoupage has lots and lots of layers. The ones that I showed you earlier just have a couple of layers, but you can really do as many as you want, as your creativity dictates. Besides regular paper, wrapping paper works really, really well. Magazine paper works really well, especially the thin glossy stuff I like to use. I hate throwing magazines away. There's so many resources that go into producing a magazine, both like human time as well as paper and ink and shipping and all of that stuff. So it just seems like such a waste to me to throw it away when you can give it new life. I feel like this is a nice way to repurpose a magazine and make it useful far longer than it takes to read it. So this little edge is sticking up a bit. I'm going to add a little bit more glue just so that I'm sure it's really, really stuck down there. This piece is a little too big for this area, or what I want for that area. I could just put it down, but I want more edges and more texture. So I'm going to go ahead and tear it and apply it a little bit smaller. And you can see here on the seam between these two pieces that paper wants to bump up. So I'm going to go back over it and add that piece again in a different direction to kind of bandage it down. Much like the first exercise we did with the structured doodling, this is, especially the first layer, is very repetitive and can be very meditative once you get into a little rhythm. This one's really long. Let me tear it too. So if you're working with kids, this is perfectly appropriate for a whole range of ages. If you're not, it's really good for, that little one just does not want to stick down. I'll use my finger, a little extra pressure there, that works. So the brushwork is a really great way to build fine motor skills. Tearing the paper into little pieces is also good for fine motor skills. Magazines, I love to use magazines again with kids because you can go on a little scavenger hunt in the magazine. You can have them find particular kinds of pictures of specific objects, for example. You could have them look for specific colors in the magazine or textures, which pictures look like they're rough, which pictures look like they're smooth, depending on what kind of design you want to do on the outside of the container. If you've got kids that are learning to read, magazines are awesome. You can have them look for sight words in the headlines especially. You can have them look for specific letters and spell their own words by cutting out letters that they find. And magazines are cool because there's so many different kinds of typography in them, especially in the headlines. So you could put together a little ransom style lettering design using the words and letters you find in the magazines. If you're a gardener, you probably have seed catalogs sitting around if you haven't thrown them out yet after you've ordered your seeds. And those are especially fun. The paper in them is usually pretty thin, so it applies really nicely. And then they either have really nice illustrations, like drawings of plants and flowers, or they've got photos of all different kinds of plants and flowers. And that is fun to use for any kind of collage or decoupage, but especially since we're doing planters here, it's very on theme and a nice way to repurpose those seed catalogs. That's another thing. I feel like so much effort goes into producing those, and they have a very short shelf life. a little bit longer maybe than magazines, since they last a whole season, but rather than just a month or two. Still, it seems like an opportunity ripe for reuse. Getting close to the end. So you could collage onto or decoupage onto a flat piece of paper and then just tape it onto your container if you want to. I like using torn pieces of paper as my base layer. Number one, because the torn pieces stick a lot better than a solid piece of paper does. This is going to be fairly permanent unless I soak it in water afterward, leave it sitting out in the rain like I said not to. It's going to last a long time. And this extra layer of glue here just provides an extra layer of protection for your container. So this design will last considerably longer than the laminated doodle design we did in the last example. But I also just like the added texture that this gives, this base layer. Since I'm using all one color, it's really subtle, but it just adds that much more interest to the container. And if my paper is a tiny bit translucent, it helps distract from the design underneath, the old container design. Here we are at the corner again. I might use my finger just to add a little bit of extra pressure there, make sure it sticks to that layer underneath. If you're curious, the difference between, well, decoupage is a type of collage. So collage is just creating new pictures out of pieces of other materials. And you can use other photos, you can use, torn pieces of paper, you can use really anything to collage natural materials. Decoupage is a layered collage. So it's defined by its layers and the way that you apply glue in between each layer. And they're usually fairly thin layers so that you can see all the way down to the bottom. It gives a really dimensional effect when you add lots of layers onto it. If you're an art history nerd, say that lovingly, you can find some really cool examples of decoupage throughout history. Victorian era decoupage is fun, medieval, not just the 1970s and 80s. I'm not sure when it was super trendy. I think it was like the 70s, right? Mod Podge. 60s. Getting there. So down towards this edge, it gets a little tricky again. We want to use the smooth edge of the paper. I want to use the smooth edge of the paper because I don't want it overhanging, but if it overhangs, you can always cut it off, or you can just kind of glue it around the corner at the bottom. Another variation on this, if all you have is glue and office paper, and presumably pens at home, you can combine this technique with the previous one. So do your structured doodle and then tear it up if you're brave and reassemble it onto your container in kind of a mosaic pattern. And you can play around then even more with how your doodles fit together, how those textures work together. getting there. So this little area here, I'm going to use smaller pieces. Whew. Okay, there we go. Finished. Okay, I've got my container all covered in the base layer now. So I've covered every inch of it with torn paper, office paper. My cats are in the room where I'm filming now, so we might have some feline visitors. One of those plants back there is catnip, so they're especially fond of that. Now that it's all covered in the base layer, it's time to start adding our more decorative elements. And since we have this nice porous base layer on our container now, we could add pretty much anything. Bottle caps, you could add rocks, sequins, plastic gems, other plastic items if you wanted to. Really anything that you can imagine that would look cool on your surface, go for it. I would love to see what you come up with. Today, I am going to be working with both tissue paper and magazine images. In the example I showed you earlier, I had done an abstract design with tissue paper, and I'm going to try to do a sort of layered dimensional garden design on this one. So I've started on this side making a couple of flowers, combining tissue paper and magazine elements for a little stylized garden effect. And I'm going to do the same, moving my way around the container here. So I'll start with some yellow tissue paper, and I'm just going to cut out suggestions of flower shapes. So flowers are kind of rounded at the bottom. I'll include some templates in the downloadable tutorial that accompanies this video. If you want to print them out and trace them, that's fine, but I really encourage people to just go for it. Freeform your flower shapes. Natural shapes, flower shapes in nature are not all identical, and they're not all perfect. Well, I guess they're perfect in their own way. But they're not perfectly symmetrical, we'll say that, and they're certainly not all the same size. So as I'm adding this decorative layer on here, I'm not as worried about overlapping edges because it has the base layer to grip to. So it doesn't need to be, I don't need to be quite as precise with this one as I was with my base layer. Get my paintbrush out of the glue. And just like before, I'm starting with a thin translucent layer here. And I've made it bigger than the piece that I'm actually gluing down, so I'm sure that it has space to fit. I'm just going to tap this one down so that it sticks in that glue. And I've got little pieces sticking up here, so I'm going to be especially careful to work from the inside of the tissue paper out. Make sure all of those edges are covered. There we go. Now, if I had all of my pieces prepared ahead of time, that would be good, because then I wouldn't be re-gluing things that didn't need to be glued, but I am just kind of going for it here. And since I don't have everything prepared, you might not either. That's okay. You're not wasting that much glue. Make it overlap that yellow one a little bit. Tap it down, smooth it down, and then coat it with its top coat from the inside out. And this is a really thin layer on top. It's pretty much totally transparent. I'm gonna do another pink one. And I save all of my paper scraps, like really all of them. You never know when they'll be useful. And even if you're not going to use them in collage, you can make them into paper, new paper, later. It's a totally different project, but one totally worth trying. I'm kind of put it at a different angle here. You know what? No, I'm gonna wait. I just decided I want to add a little piece of contrast in there before I put down that next layer. And I've got this cool, so these magazine pieces, they got a little wet somehow. We might have some background interference also since my son is up from his nap. But anyway, these magazine pieces got a little wet, so they're a little malformed, but I really like this bright citrus shape. It was on the cover of a magazine a couple of months ago. It's got great color and great texture, and so I'm going to cut it into little pieces and use it as an accent in my flower. So I'm not being precise about this at all. I'm just kind of estimating where I want this little contrast piece to go. And I'm just gonna go for it. Adding a little bit more adhesive on the top there. And I'll put this underneath. These thicker magazine pieces are a little bit harder to get to stick. So it might, whoop, like that, slid around. You might have to really push it down with your fingers. And then, whoop, there we go. Still a little slidey there. There we go. That should do it. And now that that little piece is down, I'm going to add my next tissue paper flower over here, overlapping a little bit. But then you'll be able to see that darker piece underneath, and that's what I wanted to be sure happened. Once that tissue paper is down, it's really not going to come up very easily. The magazine pieces, since they're a little bit thicker, you could probably peel off with your fingernail if you needed to, but it is good to think about how you're going to layer these before you actually start to layer, so that you don't have to go peeling things up later on. I'm going to add another contrast piece over here to my yellow flower. Let's hold that down a little bit. Make sure it sticks. Whew, he's being stubborn. Okay. Here's one. I'll add another one just kind of in the middle there. I think I've got enough glue on the base. Smooth it all out, press down, there we go. And I think I'll do two more yellow flowers, one up here and one down at the bottom. And I'm really just free-forming the petals here, making them pretty abstract. Maybe they're tulips, maybe they're zinnias, something that has like the spiky flowers that stick up, or the spiky petals that stick up a little bit. Dahlias. Dahlias kind of look like that. Kind of looks like a zinnia from the side. So then, how did I have it? It was up here. I like the yellow on top of the pink. You can really see the pink underneath. And I'm seeing over here that these magazine pieces are dry already, so I'm going to go ahead and add another layer just to really encourage them to stay stuck down. And in between, while I'm cutting new pieces, I am letting my brush soak in that water there. I'm going to add another layer of tissue paper, I think. A little bit extra opacity. Might not do a whole lot opacity-wise. A little bit. Use up some of these little scraps. You might not really be able to see it much. That's okay. I'll add a couple more of these magazine pieces. One more magazine piece over here. There. I like how that's turning out. And then I'll add one little piece of contrast here in the middle of that pink flower. I think I had one more yellow flower that I wanted to do. I'll do a little one down here. What did I say? Yellow flower, little one down here. And you'll kind of start to wrap around the side. Actually, I'm going to put a pink flower way over here off to the side, just to make sure that the design looks continuous going all the way around. I'm not as worried with the second layer about it being continuous on the, continuous for adhesion purposes. I mean, it's going to stick regardless. But I think that design-wise it'll look nice. My son is very upset that the door is closed. You can hear him expressing his displeasure in the background. Okay, let's get that guy down. There, yeah, I like how that looks going around the corner. And one more little piece of contrast on that new flower. Let's get this curved, yeah, curved one. And I didn't put another layer of adhesive down there because it was still pretty wet. And this, so you can see I've added water to my Mod Podge in this little saucer because it had started to dry out and it's getting too thin. Ooh, and it's just sliding around now. Uh-oh. If that happens, not a big deal. You just add a little bit more glue. There. And be sure to squeeze your brush out really well if you've got it in the water. A little bit more glue on top. There we go. That's better. Then I'm just going to go back over all of these little flowers and magazine pieces over here, because they're looking like they're dry already. You can always add another layer of varnish to encourage them to stay put. Okay, I've got these magazine pieces that I've cut out from various places, but what I really like to do is look for colors and textures rather than specific objects. So this is a picture of green beans, but taken out of context, it really is just kind of this cool green, leafy or viney texture. So I thought it would make a really neat stem piece. So I'm going to cut a couple of these to use as stems. It would also make really cool grass. That little shorter piece can go over here somewhere, right there. That'll work. Oh no, right there. And with these little pieces, they do tend to slide around a lot when you're applying the second layer of adhesive. So just go slowly and gently. That way they don't move from where you put them. That guy is... Oh. Here, I'm going to put him at a little bit of an angle. That's good. Okay. A couple more stems here should do it. Here's a piece that I've already cut. Yeah, that'll look good. Yeah. Oh, this last little yellow flower doesn't have any contrast yet, and I'll have to add some. I'm going to trim this one down a bit. So this little base layer is coming up. I'm just adding a little bit of extra adhesive there to stick it back down while I put this stem down as well. And having the stem on top will actually help to hold it a bit. 2 more stems, and then I'll add some leaves, and then the front layer. And I'm just laying these pieces here as I'm cutting them so that I see where I want to put them. I haven't put down adhesive yet. Oh, that's pretty wet there. Whoop. Flying magazine piece. There. Just trim the extra off of the bottom. You could also glue it down. I just prefer to trim. And then these need their top layer. I'm just going to look for, let's see, my tissue paper, some green pieces. I've got my bowl of tissue paper here. I want some green leaves. So I will pull these ones out. You could really go crazy with materials. I know I listed a couple of suggestions before, but you can combine them in all different kinds of ways. Let's cut the leaf shape out. You can combine you can combine fabric with glitter, with paper, with natural materials, buttons, really whatever you can think of. Sequins, beads. And I'm just putting leaves on here, kind of hodgepodge. I want this to look like kind of a wild summer garden, not the well-behaved spring gardens that we get before everything has really come up. Oh, that guy's coming up again. So sometimes when you start to layer them, you'll have to go back over and really make sure that they're stuck down, or else they'll bubble up a little bit. And starting from the middle, moving my way out, I'm adding that second layer of adhesive. Let's add one more leaf over here, and then I'll add some more contrast, darker pieces. Oh, and that flower still needs this contrast piece. I'll go back. Let's find another little yellow piece to add there before I forget again. I'm gonna coat whole flower over again, because he's gonna wrap around the side there. So these magazine pieces are a little bit harder to get to stick around the corner. We'll have to apply some extra pressure, and I will probably have to go back over with more adhesive afterward just to make sure he's really stuck down. Okay, I can go right there. Okay, so I think the flowers are looking good. Let's add a couple more leaf pieces. I really like these. These are little topiary trees in the magazine. I'm going to make nice emphasis pieces for my leaves. That's still pretty wet. I'll add a little bit more adhesive just to be safe. Right on the top there. And layer it down. It's a little bit like doing a puzzle, but it's a puzzle that you're inventing based on, you know, what you see in your mind's eye. There we go. Whoop. All the more reason to rest your brush in water rather than just on the table. You might pick up some extra scraps. Okay. Last leaf piece here. The good thing is when your fingers get a little sticky, then it's easier to pick up the pieces that you've dropped on your table. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to go, and I've got these kind of fun looking flower arrangements that I'm going to add right along the bottom, just bits and pieces of them to make it look a little wild and overgrown. Don't want to totally cover up what I've done though. So I will keep this fairly short. Yeah, I like this one. Ooh. Start knocking things over. There. Yeah, that fits pretty well. Kind of like that. Ooh, too far up. There we go. And there's a lot of adhesive on there already, so I'll just tap that down and trim off the excess. And add the top coat. There. I really like how that's turning out. And I'll continue that pattern all the way around the container on the last two sides. And then I will go back when I'm done adding all of those flowers and add one more clear coat of varnish. Here you can see it right on the corner there. I really like how that's looking. I might go back too and add some just decorative pieces of paper along the top edge just to give it more of a completed look and fill in some of this blank space up here, but I might not. It depends on what I plan to plant in this little planter when it's all done. If it's something that might hang over a bit, then I wouldn't do anything around the top. But there you go, decoupage. So have fun with that. I would love to see what kinds of creative combinations you come up with. We've got one more method for embellishing our containers to cover. It's the one that requires the most specialized tools and also the most adult intervention. So stay tuned. That brings us to our last decoration method. This is probably the most time intensive. It's definitely the most tool intensive. And it's the one that requires the most adult intervention. With these other ones, if you've got kids working with you, you can kind of let them go wild with the decorating of the paper in the first method. They can help you tear the paper into little pieces or cut the fabric into little pieces in the second method. If they're working on their fine motor skills, it's really great to get them practicing with the paintbrush in the decoupage. But with this last one, it's a little bit more limited, and that is because we're going for this rustic effect here, which is achieved by collecting a lot of sticks, cutting them with a sharp object, and then using hot glue to affix them to the outside of your container. If you don't have a hot glue gun, in a pinch, wood glue will also work. It just requires a little bit more patience because you can only do one side at a time because it doesn't dry quite as quickly. It requires time to cure. Hot glue is great because it dries really, really quickly, but it is also a little bit dangerous. I have definitely burned myself using a hot glue gun before. So if you have one, please be very, very careful. This rustic planter it's actually a great time of year to do it because people are trimming their bushes and everybody's got their brush piles all neatly out by the curb if you live in the city of Corning. And so I went on a walk a couple of days ago and started collecting sticks from people's brush piles. I was specifically looking for sticks that were roughly the size of my pinky around. I found that that's a really good width that balances the coverage that you get on your container as well as the ability of those sticks to actually stick to your container. It's a fine, delicate balance that we're going for. Wider sticks are not going to stick as well. Sticks sticking as well to your container. Thinner sticks will stay put really nicely on your container, but you're going to need a million of them to get any coverage on there. You, of course, can use other natural materials also. Evergreen branches are really nice. If I had space in my bag at the time, I found this pile of beautiful evergreen branches that somebody had trimmed off of their hedge that would have made a great covering for a planter, especially around like winter holiday season. It would have been really beautiful. Alas, I stuck with the regular twigs. Leaves make a really cool covering, and you can actually decoupage with leaves, especially the more pliable ones. Acorns, acorn caps are really cool. Small pieces of gravel you might play around with as a second layer. That could be really neat. Green objects that you find on the ground. Please don't go plucking things off of plants. That will hurt them. Flowers are really cool, especially if you press them first. You can use some dried flowers to interesting effect. There's lots and lots of possibilities here. Bark that you find on the ground, that works really well too because it's nice and thin and is pliable and will stick nicely to your container. Lots of different options. This one, I've started and I've left the last side blank so that I can demonstrate to you how I went about putting these sticks on here. To complete the look that I was going for, you'll need a lot of sticks, probably a lot more than you're expecting. Let me find my stick pile, which got pushed out of the way here. So this is about half of the sticks that I gathered yesterday. This should be plenty to cover the rest of this container here. And try to set them down so I don't get paint on them yet. You'll want either wood glue or a hot glue gun. I have not heated my hot glue gun up because it does get really hot and I don't like to have it sitting out around kiddos. So I'm going to use wood glue to finish off this last side. And then if you saw the demo picture for the class, you might have noticed that I had some ribbon tied around the outside of the container. You can use ribbon, you can use twine. I think kitchen string actually would look kind of cool, especially if you wrapped it around multiple times. Anything that you have on hand that can finish it off, give it a little bit more of a completed look. So, I went through my stick pile and I picked out the ones that were the closest in width to each other. If they're thin enough, you can just break them apart like that. I prefer to use my garden shears, my garden clippers, because then you get a nice flat end to the stick. You can see where I broke it, it ends up a little bit frayed, which is just not as clean looking. If you're going for the more rustic look, that's totally fine, that'll work. And let me move some of these out of the way so that you can see what I'm doing here. There, now we've got a clear space. So, there we go. Angle that towards you. I just took my stick and I measured it so that I had about 2 inches sticking up over the top of the container because I like having that sort of fringe around the top. It makes it look like a little bit of a rustic fence, I think. So I just eyeballed it again. If you want to make a template, you can definitely do that. So to make a template, you would measure your container. They're all a little bit different. This one is 5.5 on the dot inches. And then I would measure out my sticks to 7.5 on the dot inches if I wanted to do that. I'm just gonna eyeball it and cut as I go. Got my shears. Woo, this one's a tough one. There we go. And lucky me, I think I'm gonna get two pieces out of that one stick because they're roughly the same length. Go with my next one. And you can see all of these are about the same width as my pinky. And that's as wide as I'm going to get with these. Any wider and they are just way too hard to get to adhere to the container. And that's another one I'll get 2 pieces out of. Yay. These thinner ones I'm not going to throw out. They make great filler sticks. So I'm going to trim those off. I'm going to leave them long because I kind of like that branchy look up at the top. You can see some of the buds that were starting to form before this stick was trimmed and or fell off the tree. I'll set that aside to do as a second layer. Oh, this one, I'm only going to get one piece. Just trim off the bottom. It's a little bit thinner. It's a good filler stick though. So I'm taking the time to cut all of my sticks in advance because especially if I'm working with hot glue, it dries so fast that I don't want to be wasting time cutting more sticks while I am also gluing on the container. I want to have all of my materials lined up before I start to glue with this method. Got kind of a tangled bunch of sticks here. Oh no! Again, I'm hanging on to these thin sticks. I actually really like those. I'm gonna break this one off here. Whoop. And I've got my, ooh, that one fell off. Sad. Oh, have to glue that one back on later. Got a little bit of a collection here. So these sticks obviously are not going to line up perfectly. They are not perfectly straight. They've got a lot of knots and curves to them, which really adds to the rustic look of the container. But you will be able to see some of the package design underneath. And if you know that that's going to bother you, you can either plan to do multiple layers of sticks, probably 3 or 4 in that case, it'll be a really thick container, or you can cover the container with something ahead of time, either a piece of paper, you can decoupage paper onto it, you can paint it, anything to make it a little bit cleaner looking underneath. You can see on mine, I did not do that. I opted to add more layers of sticks, and I would probably go back and add additional natural materials to this afterward, maybe gluing some acorns onto it, leaves, anything for embellishments. So I've got I've got enough for most of my first layer here. I'll get a couple more. Yeah, maybe like two or 3 more. This is a fun one to combine with a nature hike, a stroll around your neighborhood, get yourself some fresh air. If you've got kids, it's a good way to get in maybe a little STEM lesson at the same time. You can go and observe seasonal changes in your neighborhood while you're gathering natural materials, see what kinds of natural materials you have around this time of year. Or if your kids are like mine, they will just want to go out and run and play, and that's totally fine too. They can go stick hunting if they want, or you can gather the sticks that you like. It's all about flexibility, right? So I'm already starting to think about what my second layer is going to look like. I'm just kind of laying the sticks on the container in preparation for the glue. You can see how they fit together. I'm not being too exacting about this. Flexibility is key. That one's got a big branch, so I'm going to trim off this one. If it were up at the top like that, that could be a really cool effect, but I want it to be a little bit smoother. Let's trim that. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to trim off both actually. Whoop, there we go. Okay, I think that's enough sticks for this demonstration right now. I would probably want a few more to finish it off. So I'm going to take my sticks off. I'm going to set my small second layer sticks aside. I'm going to take my wood glue. Wood glue usually has these nice wide applicator tips, which is good for when you're working with sticks, if you can get it open. There we go. And I'm just going to coat one section at a time. If you're working with hot glue, that's especially important. You're going to work quickly here. So it comes out in a little bit of a ribbon, which is nice. With the wood glue, you can even let it sit a little bit so that it starts to set up, and then it's a little bit more tacky, like sticky tacky. And then I'm going to play around with what sticks I want in what position. So these smaller ones I'm going to put out towards the edge. This is a really straight one. Stick it right down on top of the glue. I'm just going to let it sit there. I'm going to make sure down here, so on these other sides, I wasn't as careful, and some of the sticks are hanging off the end here. That'll make your container a little wobbly. And I'll show you a way to get around that with some finishing touches, but you do want to line the sticks up as well as you can along the bottom so that it sits nicely. So my next stick, more glue. And the wood glue is actually kind of nice because you can rearrange the sticks a little bit more than you can with the hot glue. The hot glue, once it's on there, it's on there. To remove it, you end up breaking it off and cracking the glue, so you can't really reposition it. The wood glue, the trade-off is that you do have to let it sit and cure for a while. Like 24 hours, I would say. So I'm just playing with these sticks, getting them to line up nicely, getting them as close together as I can, and making sure that they're not hanging off the bottom. And when you're working with wood glue, you want to do one side at a time. So I'll cover this one side of my milk carton. I'll let it sit and dry, not for the full 24 hours, but long enough that the sticks stay put. And then I'll turn it over and work on the second side. If I move it, of course, when it's wet, all of the sticks will just slide off and all of my hard work will be for naught. That one didn't fit quite as closely with the other ones. It's okay. So the second layer is for. I'm going to apply glue to the stick directly right here so that I can put it on top of these other sticks as the start of my second layer. And that's just because these two sticks didn't fit together quite as nicely as I had hoped. And I want to get a thicker stick in there right away, so I can see how it's shaping up. There's a little extra twig there. I just pulled it off so that it sticks better. There we go. I've got space for one more on here. This one's got kind of a cool curve to it. I'm going to put it on the corner so that that curved part comes off of the container and creates kind of like a little overhang. I think that'll look neat. Okay, first layer is complete. I'm going to hold it while I pick it up so that you can see it. But if I were to let go of it right now, it would all slide off. So be very careful if you go moving yours. There we go. Whoop. And it is very slidey, which is nice in a way because then you can make sure that your sticks are all at the bottom and not making your container wobbly. I'm going to let it sit now and dry until it sets up enough that these sticks don't move, and that could be a couple of hours. So this, if you're using wood glue, it's definitely something you want to do while you're working on other containers with other methods, or maybe you're doing several at a time. You'll just have to test it. Actually, that's, oh no, still very slidey. You can go ahead and add the second layer too while you're sitting here, while it's sitting here, just as long as you don't move that first layer. And for the second layer, with the wood glue, I'm adding it directly to the stick rather than the container. And that's just so I get it exactly where I want it to go. Using these little scrap sticks to fill in. Oh, this one was from one of my other sides. It has hot glue on it still. Dry hot glue. I'll stick right on top. Hot glue, again, would dry immediately, and you could move it and do your next side right away. Okay. So some finishing touches for these. I'm going to call my stick planter good for now. I'm going to let it sit over here and dry. Your planters, whether they are drawn upon, decoupaged, or have sticks glued all over them, are probably adorable as is, and you can stop right there and call it done. If you want, there are a few extra things you can do to bring a little more pizzazz to them, to polish them up a little bit, to make them look even more complete. And I'll show you a couple of examples. So, my favorite example I'll start with is on this fabric planter. I've actually just stuck the plant inside so I can remove it and show you what I'm talking about. A little bit of drainage going on there. I've added some fabric fringe to the outside of this container. And to do that, I have taken a hammer and a nail. I go from the inside, hold my nail here and hammer it through. You could also use a drill from the outside. And this is something that you want to do after you've decoupaged or otherwise decorated the outside of your container, because you don't want to cover up the holes with your design if you do it beforehand. So I have poked a hole about every ½ inch to ¼ inch. I did not measure it out. And then I took fabric pieces that were about 2 inches long by a ½ inch wide and threaded them through the holes and tied a little knot. Depending on how wide you can make how wide your fabric is, it will have more or less coverage. So if you wanted it to be a little bit thicker fringe, you could make your fabric pieces wider than a ½ inch. If you could also put the holes closer together, but if you do that, you do run the risk of cracking the container. If you're working with a cardboard container here, you can use a hole punch, and that's even easier. If you don't have fabric scraps on hand, you can do something like pipe cleaners. You can thread those through and twist them up at the top. The sparkly ones look especially cute. If you've got some wire, you can just thread that through and add a couple of beads to it. Twist ties, if you've got those in your kitchen, you can thread those through and add a little bit of paint to them, or some beads to the top there. If you have a really good craft stash, you might have a good collection of pom-pom balls. And pom-pom balls, of course, make everything cuter. This was kind of a rainbow-themed planter anyway, so I took some rainbow pom-pom balls and craft glue and just glued them around the rim of this yogurt container. And that helped to disguise the rim a little bit and make it look less like a yogurt container. Hot glue would have worked even better, but craft glue certainly does work there. You just have to be a little bit patient and let it set up enough so that the pom-pom balls don't fall off. With this stick planter, I've already talked a little bit about how you can use ribbon or twine to tie around the outside for a cute finishing bow. If you wanted to bring a little bit more color to it, you could add some paint, and tempera or acrylic paint work really well on this. It's a great way to get your kids involved in this last method, since it is a little bit more adult focused, since you are using potentially hot glue and sharp materials to create it. Once you've got all the sticks on there, you can let your kids loose on it with paint. You can choose individual sticks to paint. You can take Q-tips and add polka dots or stripes to it. Really, the sky is the limit there. And I think that about wraps it up for the decoration methods that I have. I'm going to move these sticks aside so I've got a little bit more space. Of course, the whole point of doing these planters is to have a place to put plants. And so you might be wondering what some tips would be for making your plants extra happy in here. You can, of course, start with seedlings, but you can also start with seeds. They grow really nicely. If you've already started seeds in other pots in your garden, this size of planter makes a nice intermediary step before you start to harden them off to go into the ground. We still have quite a few weeks left before you want to put your plants outside in the ground, especially vegetables and soft herbs or tender herbs. So they might be getting too big for your starting pots. These are a really great next step for those. To prepare the pots, I'm going to get some materials here. I should say, getting stuck with sticks. To prepare the pots for planting, because we've already prepared them the first way, by drilling holes in them. So those holes are really good for your plants. They are going to allow for proper drainage so that your plants don't get waterlogged and essentially drown, which would be very, very sad. However, with these big holes especially, you do run the risk of losing dirt out of the drainage holes, and you don't want to do that because then your plants will also be sad because they need soil to grow. So what I like to do is take a coffee filter. These are pretty sturdy. They are made to hold up to being soaked with water, especially if you let them dry out in between waterings. They're not going to fall apart super easily. Place a coffee filter in the bottom of your container so that it covers the hole there. You can stop right there if you want, but even better is to add a few rocks or a small layer of gravel. Let me find where I put my rocks. Here they are. So I've just got these rocks that I found outside. I'm going to place them inside my container. I have a finished one that I can use to demo. I don't think I do. Inside my container just to weight that coffee filter down. Now I am ready to add my dirt. Those rocks in that coffee filter will help with the aeration furthermore and drainage. So the one thing you do not want to do, I should say, when you're filling your containers with soil, you do not want to just go out in your yard and dig up some dirt and stick it in your container. Yard dirt, unfortunately, is usually very compacted and will make your plants very unhappy if you put them directly in that. Especially when you add water to it and then it dries out, it basically just becomes rock hard. When you remove all of the grass and roots from it, it solidifies into basically dirt rock. And it will make these tender herbs very, very unhappy. Their little roots won't be able to get through to get to the nutrients. So the solution is to either purchase pre-made potting soil. Doesn't have to be that brand, of course. You can order this online. This is an 8-quart bag. It's pretty big. It's going to fill probably 4 of these containers. And I think it costs like $8 online. You can also get 4-quart bags, which is plenty for this kind of project. You can also order them for pickup if you want. If you don't want to pre-purchase potting soil, that's totally fine too. There are many ways to DIY your own potting soil with things that you might have sitting around your house or easily accessible. So the first step there, I'm not going to demonstrate it right now just because it is fairly labor intensive, but I will write out all of the instructions for you and put it in the written tutorial that will be included with the archived video tomorrow on the library page and on my page. So your first step is to sterilize your yard dirt, which sounds a little scary, but really isn't. You'll dig up a little bit of dirt, enough to fill your container, and then you'll crumble it onto a cookie sheet, put it into your oven at 250 degrees for about a half hour. And that'll kill any bacteria or fungus that's growing in your dirt that could potentially cause your plants or your seeds to rot in your containers. After that, your main concern is really going to be drainage again, just like it was earlier. We went to all this trouble to put holes in your containers so that you would be able to get rid of the excess water. But if your soil is compacted yard dirt, your water is not going to be able to drain out of it. What commercial soil mixes usually add are vermiculite and perlite, which are two non-renewable minerals that are very effective at maintaining a balance between water absorption and water drainage. You can also add something like sphagnum moss, which is commercially available, or coconut coir, which is a renewable resource that has a similar effect to sphagnum moss. That just adds a little bit of organic bulk to your soil and makes it easier for the roots to permeate, makes it easier for the water to drain out. So those are two commercially available products that you can add to your soil. However, you might have something even better sitting around your house that is not otherwise recyclable and would just cause a burden on our stream of waste if you didn't use it, and that is styrofoam packing peanuts. Personally, I hate them. I just think that they're terrible. They cling to you, they're full of static, you can't recycle them, they end up in our waterways. But they're really useful for indoor houseplants. If you crumble them up and add them to your soil at a ratio of about, I would say, 1/6 packing peanut crumbles to 5 parts. So one part packing peanut crumbles to 5 parts soil. That goes a long way towards helping aerate the soil without adding a lot of weight, which is really important for houseplants too. If you have them sitting on a shelf or maybe you have them hanging up somewhere, you don't want your pots to be super heavy. Don't add them to soil that you intend to put in your garden. Hopefully that goes without saying, because then the styrofoam will end up out in the environment, which is what we are trying to avoid. The last option you have to add some friendly bulk to your soil is to use coarse ground sand. Sometimes you'll hear this called construction sand or builder's sand. It is not playground sand. Playground sand is really finely ground, which makes it nice to play in, but that also means that when you add water to it, it compacts much more readily. So the coarse ground sand is what you're looking for, and you want to add that in about the same ratio to your soil. So I would say about 1/3 of a cup of sand to a container like this, maybe 1/4 of a cup. Add it to there and then add your dirt on top, mix it all together, and you will be all set. Or you can just go and buy some potting soil, and that works too. You might have seed packets sitting around, in which case, great, you are all set. Follow the directions on your seed packets. You can plant them directly into your containers. If you do not have seed packets, you've got a couple of different options for finding seeds around your house. My favorite, and the one that I've had the most luck with, are squash seeds left over from your dinner scraps. So these are butternut squash seeds. Basically, you don't throw them out. You take them and you try to remove as much of this pulpy stuff as possible. So this, unfortunately, was from dinner a couple nights ago, and the pulp has dried on it. If you soak it in water, it becomes soft again. You can pull the pulp off. I pull all of the seeds off, I put them in a fine mesh sieve like this, and then I run them under the tap to get them extra clean. Once all of the pulp is removed, I lay them out on a paper towel and let them air dry overnight. When you let them dry out like that, it prevents mold from growing on the seeds. Mold will kill your seeds before they have a chance to germinate, so you want them to be nice and healthy before you plant them. And then, once they're dry, they're pretty much ready for planting. You can do the same thing with any kind of pepper seeds, any kind of squash seeds. The one kind of squash that I haven't had luck with are zucchinis. So the store-bought zucchinis seem to be harvested before they are fully mature in the seed sense. So the seeds in them are not quite mature enough to germinate. And that of course makes them tastier because they're smaller and you can just eat them. If you let the zucchinis get really big and mature and the seeds get big enough, you wouldn't want to eat the seeds. You'd have to pull them out of the zucchini. With the peppers, any kind of pepper works. Sweet peppers, jalapeno pepper, habanero pepper, whatever you feel like trying to grow. I would certainly experiment with the food that you have on hand. If you are already purchasing it to eat, that makes it a really good food for you to grow because then it'll be useful for you. You can also use dried beans. So black beans, pinto beans, garbanzo beans, green lentils are all good ones to try. Red lentils, the type that you buy that look red, are actually split, so those seeds will not germinate. If you can find whole red lentils, they look brown, but they're red on the inside, those will germinate, so you can experiment with those. With dried beans, you want to soak them in water overnight as if you were going to cook them. That helps soften the shell and make it a little bit easier for them to germinate. You can also wrap them in a damp paper towel, put them inside a plastic bag, and stick them in a warm and sunny spot for a few days. Wait for them to sprout, and then very, very gently transplant them into your container. If you are transplanting already sprouted seeds, you want to be very careful that you don't break off that little sprout because that will kill your seed. Those are probably the best kind of plants to use in these containers. Squash, of course, you'll eventually have to transplant, but anything larger than that. Melons, for example, you could try starting in these containers. They don't really like being transplanted though, that's the only challenge. They do much better when they're directly sown in your garden. Corn is another one. If you've got popping corn, that's a seed that you can germinate. And that it looks really cool when you get little mini corn stalks growing in here. They don't get very big just because the container is so small, but you can get little mini corn, and I've actually gotten little tiny corn cobs. It's tried very hard to put out corn cobs for me in this size container. If you keep whole herbs and spices, or rather whole spices on hand, there are several that you can try to germinate as well. So cumin seeds, coriander seeds, fennel seeds, all of those are good ones to try. If you're not working with a seed packet, you might be saying, how do I know how to plant them? You can always try Googling the specific or searching online for the specific kind of seed guidelines that you're planting, but I usually go by just a very general rule of thumb, and that is the larger the seed is, the deeper you plant it. The smaller the seed is, the closer it should be to the surface. So very tiny seeds like basil or very small herb seeds, pepper seeds, well, not pepper seeds, but very small herb seeds can just be sprinkled right on the top. Pepper seeds, you might want to tap down a little bit. They're still pretty small. You cover them with just a very light dusting of soil. These guys, these squash seeds, are pretty big, so you can push them down almost a full knuckle length and they will be happy and germinate there for you. Other things that you can try planting, really you can plant any seed that you find in your kitchen. Your results will just vary. So not every seed grows into a plant that looks like its parent. Tomatoes are one that you might get some funky varieties from if you try planting them. Apples, you will probably not get fruit because they take a very long time to mature, but they will sprout for you. Citrus will sprout for you, but it takes a very long time to mature. I've never tried saving berry seeds, but that would be a fun experiment for you to try also. I really encourage you to experiment with what you have on hand, both in terms of seeds as well as in terms of craft materials for decorating your containers. And please, please, please post the results of your projects in the comments to this video when it's archived on the library site and on my own site, because I would love to see how everybody's different containers turn out. I threw a lot of information at you today. We went over different kinds of containers that you can use, how to prepare them, 3 different methods for decorating them and variations you can use on those methods. Some suggestions for things that you might try exploring with materials on hand. And then we even went into guidelines for keeping your plants happy once they are living in your containers. I know that it's a lot to digest, and I expect that you did not follow along. Hopefully now you can go and round up the materials you want to work with. This video will be archived on the library page and on my page, and then I will also type up a text-based tutorial for you to download and use to follow along for each of the methods that we've gone over today. I'll also go back in the next couple of days and look for any comments or questions left on the video and answer those to the best of my ability or point you in another exploratory direction. So please feel free to continue to comment and ask questions as you work through your projects on your own. And I can't wait to see what you come up with. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you are leaving today with some good ideas, maybe head spinning a little bit and ready to get your hands dirty, both with glue and with actual dirt. So have a great afternoon.